JFK Airport never slept, but tonight something shifted, flashing red and blue lights, a black Escalade, two cops moving in, aggressive, no explanation, no hesitation. Big Shaq stepped out, 6'7", unshaken. They thought they were in control. They weren't. Then, screeching tires, a black SUV, government plates, men in suits, badges flashing. The power flipped in an instant. The world watched. Cameras rolled. The truth had just begun to unravel. This wasn't a stop. It was a warning. Before we deep dive into this interesting story, subscribe to our channel and tell us where are you watching from. Share in the comments below. The flashing red and blue lights slashed through the thick night air, illuminating the crowded drop-off lane at JFK Airport. Engines rumbled, horns honked, and distant voices mixed into a chaotic urban symphony. The air smelled of jet fuel, damp asphalt, and tension. A jet-black Escalade rolled to a slow stop near Terminal 4. Its chrome rims gleamed under the streetlights, tinted windows concealing the driver. For a brief moment there was silence, a small pocket of stillness amid the constant motion of New York City. Then, two cops approached. The lead officer, a burly man with cold, narrowed eyes, rested a hand on his holster as he leaned toward the driver's side window. His partner, a younger cop with an uneasy stance, stayed a step behind. Neither spoke. Neither gave the usual greeting. The driver's window hummed down smoothly. Big Shaq. He sat behind the wheel, his broad shoulders barely fitting the seat, his expression unreadable. His 6'7" frame didn't just occupy space, it commanded it. A sharp jawline, deep-set eyes, and a calm yet calculating demeanor, the kind of presence that made men either respect you or fear you. His voice came low even. "Something I can help you with, officer." The lead cop didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, measured look inside the SUV. His gaze swept over the leather seats, the faint glow of the dashboard, and the reflection of the airport's departure screens bouncing off the glossy hood. Then, with a smirk, he said, "Step out of the vehicle." Shaq didn't move. He didn't flinch. The muscles in his arms remained relaxed, hands resting on the wheel. "You got a reason for this stop?" Silence. But the way the officers exchanged glances, quick, almost imperceptible, made something clear. Something wasn't right. A murmur ran through the growing crowd of travelers. Phones were coming out. Screens glowed like fireflies in the dark. People were watching, recording. A few whispered to each other, recognizing the man in the driver's seat. A woman in a business suit nudged her husband. "That's Big Shaq." A teenager whispered to his friend. "No way." "Him?" The officer's smirk widened slightly, like a man enjoying a game he knew he was about to win. He tapped the roof of the Escalade with 2 fingers, slow and deliberate. "Not gonna ask again. Step out of the vehicle." Shaq inhaled through his nose, exhaled through his mouth, controlled, steady. Then finally, he moved. His massive hand reached for the door handle, gripping it tight enough that his knuckles flexed. With one smooth motion, he pushed the door open and stepped out. The air shifted. The cops stiffened. The people watching, they could feel it. Shaq didn't just step out. He unfolded himself from the SUV like a storm breaking loose from the sky. His presence was a statement, and every single person in that moment knew it. The younger cop, the one standing a step back, visibly swallowed. His hand twitched near his belt. The lead officer, though? He didn't back down. If anything, his smirk grew wider. He had been waiting for this. Shaq stood there, shoulders squared, hands loose at his sides. Now what? The lead cop circled him, slow and casual, like a shark. The crowd shifted, some whispering, some holding their breath. The officer finally stopped in front of him, looking up, because everyone had to look up at Big Shaq. "You got a warrant out." Shaq arched an eyebrow. "For what?" Another beat of silence. The young cop hesitated, glancing at his partner like he wanted to say something but couldn't. The lead cop ignored it. "Doesn't matter. Hands behind your head." Shaq didn't move. The tension tightened, thick as steel wire. The officer took a step closer, voice dropping to a quiet threat. "You deaf?" "Hands. Behind. Your head." Shaq tilted his head just slightly. You sure about this? The lead cop's smirk twitched, just for a second. Shaq wasn't being defiant. He wasn't raising his voice or squaring up. But the way he stood, the way he stared into that cop's soul, it felt like a test, like he was giving him one last chance to make the right call. But the officer had already made his choice. He reached for his cuffs, and that's when everything changed. Screech. A black SUV with government plates came out of nowhere, stopping inches from the curb. Doors flew open. 3 men in dark suits stepped out, moving fast, their expressions grim. The lead cop's smirk vanished. People in the crowd gasped. Some backed up, sensing something bigger unfolding. One of the suited men flashed a badge. Feds. The lead officer's hand froze mid-motion on his belt. The tallest Fed, a sharp-eyed man with silver hair, pointed at the cops. Step away from the man. Now. Silence crashed over the scene. The young cop looked like he had seen a ghost. The lead cop stared at the Feds, something like panic flickering in his eyes. Then, his radio buzzed. He reached for it. Clicked it on. A crackling voice came through. Officer Mason, you and your partner are officially relieved of duty. Effective immediately. The color drained from his face. The younger cop, the one who had been hesitating this whole time, stepped back, eyes darting between the Feds, the crowd, and his now former partner. Shaq didn't move. He just watched. The lead cop's lips parted slightly like he was about to argue. But he didn't. He couldn't. One of the federal agents handed Shaq a small, folded piece of paper. No words. Just a knowing glance. Shaq took it. Opened it. Read what was inside. His jaw tightened. His eyes darkened. The lead cop, now a suspended officer, looked at him, and for the first time all night, fear crept into his face. Because now, he understood. This wasn't just a routine stop. This wasn't just about power or authority. This was something bigger. Something way above his pay grade. The Feds stepped aside, giving Shaq a clear path. Without another word, Shaq turned, stepped back into his Escalade, and shut the door. The engine rumbled to life. The former cop? He could only stand there, helpless, as the black SUV pulled away, disappearing into the night. But as Shaq drove off, gripping the wheel tighter than before, he knew one thing for sure. This wasn't over. Not even close. As Shaq stood outside his Escalade, the cold night air pressing against his skin, something in his stance told a deeper story. This wasn't unfamiliar territory. The flashing lights, the overreaching cops, the weight of unspoken threats. He had been here before. Not here at an airport, not under these exact circumstances, but in this moment. This thin line between control and chaos. His breath was steady, his hands relaxed, but his eyes carried something dangerous. For a second, the night blurred. A courtroom, a gavel slamming. Sentenced to 5 years with the possibility of parole. Another flash. A dimly lit Jim, sweat dripping from his brow, fists wrapped tight as he pounded into a heavy bag. Each hit fueled by something beyond rage, something deeper, a promise. And then, back to reality. Shaq caught the way the lead cop shifted, the way his partner subtly adjusted his stance. It was slight, but Shaq's instincts caught it. A nervous twitch, the flicker of recognition in their eyes, like they were trying to place him but couldn't quite put it together. He had seen that look before, from men who had heard his name in whispers, but never expected to stand in front of him. The young cop's fingers tightened around his holster. It wasn't an overt threat, not yet, but Shaq saw the hesitation, the conflict. That boy wasn't ready for whatever he thought he was getting into. Shaq held his gaze for a fraction of a second, then turned his attention back to the lead cop. You know who I am. It wasn't a question. The lead cop's smirk faltered. It was a blink and you miss it moment, but Shaq caught it. The older man had been cocky a second ago, acting like he had the upper hand. But now, under the weight of Shaq's stare, he looked unsure. The young cop shifted uncomfortably. Maybe he didn't recognize Shaq, but he sure as hell recognized the shift in power. The lead cop covered his unease with a scoff. Doesn't matter who you are. You've got a warrant. Shaq didn't flinch. He knew the game. He had lived the game. A dirty cop trying to flex authority, testing the waters, waiting for a reason to escalate. But Shaq wasn't giving him one. Not tonight. Then read it, Shaq said, voice calm but edged with something dangerous. The cop hesitated. Shaq tilted his head slightly. Go on, read it. The lead cop's jaw tightened. The young one looked at his partner like he wanted to say something, like maybe he knew this wasn't right, but he stayed silent. Shaq exhaled through his nose. You don't have one, do you? The lead cop's smirk returned, but it wasn't as sure as before. Doesn't work like that. It does, Shaq countered. If you had a warrant, you'd have read it already. The crowd murmured. Phones were still recording. The tension in the air was thick enough to choke on. The younger cop looked down, shifting his weight. His jaw clenched. He knew. Maybe he wasn't as dirty as his partner. Maybe he had just enough conscience left to feel the wrongness of the moment. The lead cop took a step forward, trying to reclaim ground. You're coming with us. Now you can do it the easy way or... Shaq let out a quiet chuckle, shaking his head. The sound made the lead cop falter. You want me in cuffs? Shaq said, taking a step closer. But you're not sure why. The cop bristled. I don't need a reason. Shaq's expression darkened. Wrong answer. Because that was the truth of it, wasn't it? This wasn't about a crime. This wasn't about justice. This was about power. About a man like Shaq standing in the wrong place at the wrong time, in the wrong skin. It didn't matter who he was, what he'd done, or what he hadn't done. To the cop in front of him, he was someone to control. The realization wasn't angering. It was just exhausting. He had been down this road before, years ago. Different city, different uniform. A dark alley. Rain pouring. The red and blue lights flashing against the wet pavement. A badge in his pocket, blood on his knuckles. Another cop staring at him, not with fear but with disgust. You're one of us, the man had sneered. Start acting like it. But he hadn't. And that's why he had walked away. Back in the present, Shaq blinked, grounding himself. He wasn't that man anymore. He had built something different. He had left that world behind. Hadn't he? Then why did this moment feel like a thread being pulled, unraveling something he had buried? The cop was still talking, trying to sound tough, but Shaq wasn't listening anymore. He was watching, waiting. Because if there was one thing he had learned, it was that people show their true colors when they think they're winning. And then, it happened. The lead cop made a mistake. His hand twitched toward his belt, not for his gun, but for his cuffs. But the motion was too aggressive, too sudden, and the young cop panicked. His gun was out before he could think. Aimed. At Shaq. The crowd gasped. The lead cop's eyes went wide. Daniels, what the hell are you doing? Daniels, the rookie, froze, realizing what he had done. His hands trembled. His breathing was fast, shallow. He wasn't built for this. Shaq didn't move, didn't blink. He had seen too many guns in his lifetime to flinch at this one. Daniels' fingers flexed against the trigger. The lead cop moved fast, gripping his partner's wrist, pushing the gun downward. Jesus Christ, put that thing away. Daniels' hands were shaking. He didn't do anything, the lead cop snapped. And just like that, the cracks widened. The power dynamic shifted. Because if the lead cop had been so sure of Shaq's guilt, if he had been so sure he was in control, he would have let Daniels pull the trigger. But he hadn't. Because he knew. He knew this was bullshit. The lead cop lowered Daniels' arm forcefully. Holster your damn weapon before you get us both killed. Daniels blinked rapidly, his chest rising and falling too fast, his entire body language screaming regret. His hands fumbled, and after a shaky second, he shoved the gun back into his holster. The crowd wasn't just watching now. They were angry. A man's voice cut through the murmurs. They tried to set him up. A woman's voice followed. You saw that, right? The younger one pulled a gun for no reason. Another voice, sharper, angrier. This is why we don't trust cops. The lead cop clenched his jaw, realizing he had lost control of the scene. Shaq just stared at him. "You done?" The older man looked at him, really looked at him, and Shaq saw it, the understanding, the recognition. Maybe not of his name, but of his type. The type of man you don't break. The lead cop's radio crackled. He grabbed it, listened, and suddenly, he went pale. Daniels looked at him. "What is it?" The cop didn't answer. He just stepped back. That's when Shaq knew. Something bigger was at play, and whatever it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The night carried a pulse of unease, rippling through the crowd like an invisible storm. The airport's drop-off lane was no longer just another congested checkpoint. It had become a battleground of tension, authority, and unspoken histories. Conversations hushed, replaced by the soft whir of phone cameras capturing everything. Travelers, taxi drivers, and airport staff watched, some openly, others discreetly, but all with the same curiosity simmering beneath their skin. Some recognized him, some didn't. But the ones who did, they exchanged wary looks, muttering under their breath. "That's Big Shaq. No way, man, what's he doing here? Dude used to..." Shh. A businesswoman in heels clutched her rolling suitcase tighter, her pace slowing as she lingered, ears tuned in. A pair of college students, one gripping his coffee like it was a lifeline, nudged each other, eyes flicking between Shaq and the officers. A middle-aged cab driver leaned against his car, arms folded, lips pressed together. He had seen things like this before, too many times. But what made this different? Across the parking lot, separated from the growing chaos, sat a sleek, obsidian-black sedan. Its engine was off, but inside, a figure sat in the driver's seat, watching. The man was impeccably dressed. Dark gray suit, crisp white shirt, a tie so perfectly knotted it might as well have been ironed in place. His wristwatch glinted faintly under the dim overhead lights, but he didn't check the time. He didn't need to. Everything was unfolding exactly when it was supposed to. His fingers moved slowly over the phone in his hand. He pressed a single contact. A low voice answered on the other end. "Yeah?" The man in the sedan watched as Shaq stood firm, unshaken by the cops in front of him. He saw the subtle way the older officer's stance shifted, the nervous flicker in the younger one's eyes. He observed the crowd leaning in, their anticipation thickening with every passing second. "They made their move," the man in the suit murmured, his voice as smooth as the leather interior of his car. He watched Shaq, his expression unreadable. "Now let's see if he makes his." He ended the call. Back at the Escalade, Shaq noticed it, the officer's hand twitching near his belt. Not his gun, his cuffs. That meant one of two things. Either the cop had realized this wasn't going the way he planned, and he was trying to salvage the situation without drawing his weapon. Or, Shaq's voice cut through the thick air, low and lethal. "You reach for that, you better be sure." The lead cop stopped cold. His hand hovered, just inches away from his belt. It was a small thing, barely a movement. But to Shaq it screamed volumes. Hesitation. Doubt. And in this kind of situation, doubt was dangerous. The younger cop, Daniels, shifted his weight uneasily. His face was tight with nerves. Maybe he wasn't dirty like his partner, but he was in too deep now. Shaq took a slow step forward. Not aggressive, not threatening. Just enough to make his presence feel larger, to remind them who they were dealing with. "You need to start thinking real carefully about your next move," he said. The lead cop exhaled sharply through his nose. He knew he was losing control of the situation. He could feel it. The balance had shifted. He had come into this encounter believing he was the predator. Now, he wasn't so sure. From the sedan, the mystery man continued to watch. His fingers drummed lightly against the steering wheel, his eyes narrowing slightly. Shaq was handling this well, as expected. But how long could he hold the line? A flicker of movement in the crowd caught his attention. Two men in plain clothes, standing just on the edge of the scene. They weren't holding phones like everyone else. They weren't watching in passive curiosity. They were assessing, calculating. The man in the suit exhaled slowly, his eyes locked onto them. "Now, what do we have here?" he muttered to himself. Meanwhile, back at the Escalade, Shaq could feel the weight of the crowd's eyes pressing on the back of his neck. The tension wasn't just between him and the cops anymore. It was bigger, and that's when he knew. This wasn't just a routine stop. It wasn't even just about him. It was a test. Somebody wanted to see how he would react. And someone else wanted to see if they could break him. Daniels cleared his throat, looking almost desperate to de-escalate. Maybe we should... A new sound cut through the night. Footsteps. Sharp, deliberate. A woman's voice. That won't be necessary, officer. All eyes turned. A new figure stepped forward. She was tall, poised, and carried herself with the kind of authority that didn't need to be announced. Her navy blue coat was buttoned tight against her frame, an official-looking badge clipped onto her belt. Her eyes, cold, calculating, landed directly on the lead officer. And then, something remarkable happened. The lead cop took a step back. It was slight, almost imperceptible, but Shaq saw it. The man had been posturing all night, but now he was standing in front of someone he actually feared. The woman glanced at Shaq, just for a second, not an ounce of surprise in her expression, like she already knew who he was. The lead cop stiffened. Agent Monroe, we were just... leaving. Her voice was cool, firm. That's what you were just doing. The older officer's lips pressed into a tight line. Daniels looked like he wanted to evaporate into thin air. The crowd felt the shift. Some of them were still recording, waiting to see how this new piece of the puzzle fit. Shaq studied Monroe, his expression unreadable. This was getting deeper. Bigger than just a bad cop flexing his power. Bigger than a random stop. And the man in the sleek black sedan? He watched it all unfold, his fingers still lightly tapping against the steering wheel. A small smile tugged at the corner of his lips. Shaq had passed the first test, but the next one? That was coming soon. And it was going to be much, much harder. The airport's drop-off lane was no longer just a place for hellos and goodbyes. It had become a stage, its actors unwillingly cast in a scene where the script was still being written. The night air was thick with something invisible yet suffocating. A storm on the verge of breaking. Shaq stood his ground, his massive frame unmoving. A pillar against the tides of manufactured authority pressing against him. He wasn't just standing up to two cops. He was standing up to something bigger, something unseen but undeniably present. The whispers in the crowd had died down, replaced by the hum of engines, the soft shuffle of restless feet, and the distant sound of a plane roaring overhead. And then, the lead cop spoke. "We got a warrant. Your name's on it." Shaq's gaze remained steady, but something shifted in his stance, just enough for those paying attention to notice. He tilted his head slightly, his deep voice smooth but edged with steel. "For what?" The lead cop didn't answer immediately. His smirk was gone, replaced by something else. Annoyance, uncertainty, fear. Whatever it was, it flickered in his eyes before he locked it away behind that same overconfident stare. "You don't ask questions," he snapped. Shaq let out a slow exhale through his nose, measuring the weight of those words. He had been in plenty of rooms where people told him not to ask questions. Courtrooms, back offices, shadowy spaces where conversations were carried in whispers and sealed with signatures. That answer wasn't just weak. It was dangerous. The rookie cop, Daniels, looked uneasy. He shifted on his feet, his eyes darting between his partner and Shaq, like a man staring at a ticking bomb and realizing he might be standing too close. Something wasn't adding up. The muscles in his jaw clenched, and Shaq saw it. That moment when someone knows the truth but hasn't yet found the courage to say it out loud. Shaq stepped closer, slow, deliberate. Not enough to be a threat, but just enough to remind them both who they were dealing with. "Then we got a problem," he said, voice low. The crowd had fallen completely silent. The tension coiled like a snake, waiting, waiting. Then, in a voice that barely broke the night air, Daniels blurted out, "Wait, this ain't right." The lead cop's head snapped toward him. His entire body stiffened like a man who had just heard the wrong words at the worst possible time. "Shut up, Daniels." His voice was razor sharp, cutting through the space between them. But Daniels had already said too much. The crack had formed. The foundation beneath this entire staged encounter had started to crumble. Shaq watched the rookie's inner war unfold in real time. He could see it in the way Daniels' fingers twitched at his sides, the way his breathing hitched, the way his pupils darted around like a man trying to find an escape hatch that didn't exist. He knew something, and he wasn't supposed to say it. The lead cop's nostrils flared. His patience was gone. His entire play was unraveling, and Shaq saw the moment his frustration boiled over into something reckless. He reached for Shaq. It was fast, too fast, but not fast enough. Shaq saw it coming the moment the officer's shoulder tensed. A move born from ego and desperation, not control. The lead cop lunged, fingers reaching for Shaq's wrist like he was about to force him into submission. But Shaq, a man who had spent years learning to read movements before they happened, was already moving. Not away, not back, but forward. He shifted just enough to break the cop's momentum. The officer stumbled, his balance thrown, and for a second, just a second, he looked completely out of control. Shaq didn't even need to touch him. The man caught himself, straightened, and the moment he did, his face twisted into something ugly. Shame, anger, humiliation. The crowd saw everything. Daniels took a half step back, like he wanted no part of what was about to happen. The lead cop, breath coming a little harder now, seethed. He wasn't thinking anymore. He was reacting. And reacting men like him? That's when they became dangerous. His hand flew to his belt. Shaq's eyes locked onto it, every muscle in his body primed. Not fear. Readiness. The crowd stirred. A voice in the back called out, "Yo, what the hell?" Then, "Officer Mason, stand down." The words hit like a thunderclap. A new voice, authoritative, unshakable, every head turned. A new figure emerged, cutting through the scene like a blade through fog. Tall, mid-40s, a face carved from stone, and a presence that made everyone straighten instinctively. The kind of man who didn't just walk into situations. He ended them. And Shaq? Shaq knew him. The lead cop, Officer Mason, went rigid. His face turned ashen as he snapped to attention. "Sir, you were just about to make a career-ending mistake." The man cut him off. His badge gleamed under the streetlights. FBI. The crowd reacted instantly. Gasps, whispers. Someone cursed under their breath. Daniels looked like he had just witnessed a ghost walk out of the shadows. Mason swallowed hard. He knew exactly who he was dealing with now. "Sir," he tried again, his voice losing its confidence. "I was following protocol." The FBI agent, Special Agent Cole Donovan, cocked his head slightly, gaze piercing through the lie. "You don't have a warrant." It wasn't a question. Mason hesitated. You don't have anything." Mason shut his mouth. Daniels looked down. Shaq didn't move, didn't speak. He just watched. Agent Donovan exhaled, slow and measured, like he was reeling in 1,000 words he wanted to say but didn't need to. Then he turned to Shaq. "Apologies for the inconvenience, Mr. Shaq." The lead cop flinched. He hadn't known. He hadn't known who he was trying to take down. But Donovan? Donovan had known the entire time, and that meant something else was going on here. Shaq met the agent's gaze. "Didn't think I'd see you again." Donovan's lips twitched. Not a smile, not quite. "Didn't think I'd have to step in this soon." That made Mason's face twist in confusion. This soon? Daniels, still looking pale, exhaled and rubbed a shaky hand down his face. He looked at Shaq differently now. The crowd, still buzzing, was leaning into this new development. The entire situation had turned into something bigger than they had expected. Donovan turned his gaze back to Mason. "You and your partner are done here, immediately." Mason opened his mouth, but no words came out, because there was nothing left to say. Daniels took another step back like he wanted to disappear, and Shaq, he just watched them crumble. Because this wasn't the end. This was just the beginning. A thick silence wrapped around the airport's drop-off lane, squeezing the air until every breath felt heavy. The scene had already stretched past its breaking point. Shaq standing firm, the crowd watching, Daniels caught in the crossfire of morality, and Mason desperately trying to regain control. Then, Screech! A black SUV with government plates tore through the night, tires gripping hard as it came to an abrupt stop near the curb. For a split second, everything froze. Then the doors flew open. 3 men stepped out, each one moving with precision, like they had done this 1,000 times before. Their black suits were crisp, their expressions unreadable. They weren't here to watch. They weren't here to talk. They were here to end this. Badges flashed. One of the men, a lean, broad-shouldered agent with piercing eyes, spoke first. "Officers Mason and Turner, drop your weapons. Now." Mason's face drained of color. Daniels stiffened beside him, his breathing uneven. The weight of every wrong decision made tonight seemed to press down on him all at once. The moment stretched, thick with indecision. Mason's fingers flexed against his holster, not reaching for it, not yet, but not stepping back either. His mind was working fast, trying to find an out. Then, a vibration. A phone buzzing in Mason's pocket. His instincts kicked in. He pulled it out, just enough to glance at the screen, and whatever he saw there, it turned his skin gray. No, this ain't happening. The suited man took another step forward, voice calm but final. Happening? Oh, it's already done. Mason's fingers twitched. Every muscle in his body screamed for him to fight, to push back, to refuse whatever invisible hand had just wiped his power from existence. But the men in suits were standing in front of him, and the reality was suffocating. He had lost. Shaq didn't move. He didn't need to. His presence was already cemented in the moment. He had known something bigger was at play. The pieces were only now falling into place, revealing a picture he wasn't sure he wanted to see. Daniels turned slightly, just enough to catch Shaq's eye, and in that instant, Shaq saw it. The realization that the younger cop had never been in control. Not tonight. Not ever. Daniels had been a pawn, a kid placed in the middle of something he never signed up for. One of the suited men pulled out a document, a thin, folded set of papers. He didn't hand them to Mason. He didn't even acknowledge the man's trembling stance. Instead, he turned toward Agent Cole Donovan. "Direct orders. Signed. Effective immediately." Donovan took the paper, unfolding it smoothly. His eyes scanned the contents, his jaw tightening just slightly. The final nail in the coffin. Mason saw it. His throat bobbed as he swallowed, his breath uneven. This is a mistake," he forced out. The suited man didn't flinch. "The only mistake was thinking this wasn't going to catch up with you." Mason let out a shaky exhale, and for the first time all night, he looked small. Not a man in charge. Not an officer. Just a man who had lost everything in a single moment. Daniels, still shaking, took a slow step away from his partner, as if the taint of Mason's corruption might be contagious. He kept his hands visible, no sudden movements, no attempts to salvage something that was already over. Mason turned toward him, desperation creeping into his voice. "Daniels!" Daniels flinched. Mason closed his mouth. The suited man gave them one last look, then lifted his chin toward Donovan. "They're yours now." And just like that, the scene shifted. Mason and Daniels weren't officers anymore. They weren't in control. They weren't anything. Shaq could see it in Mason's empty stare. The man who had swaggered into this moment, believing he was untouchable, now looked like he had been gutted from the inside out. Donovan exhaled, slow and measured, as he folded the document neatly and slid it into his coat. Then he turned to Shaq. For a second, neither of them spoke. It wasn't hostility. It was something older, something that had been waiting for its time to surface. Finally, Donovan spoke, his voice lower than before. "You good?" Shaq studied him for a long moment. The weight of the night sat heavy in his chest. The ghosts of old fights, old betrayals, old wars he thought he had left behind. They had just walked right back into his life. And the worst part? He didn't even know which side they were on. Shaq let out a slow breath. "I'm still standing." Donovan gave a small nod. "Good." He glanced toward the black SUV, the men in suits still watching from the sidelines. "Get in." Shaq didn't move right away. He could feel the crowd still watching, their phones still rolling, the internet already writing its own version of tonight. But this wasn't over. Not even close. So, after one last glance at Mason, pale, humiliated, and broken, Shaq turned toward the SUV. The moment he slid inside, the door shut with a heavy thunk. Outside, the scene still buzzed with tension. The crowd's murmurs grew louder, whispers turning into theories, opinions, questions. But inside the vehicle, there was only silence. Donovan sat across from him, his hands clasped together, his expression unreadable. Shaq leaned back, exhaling slowly. His pulse had finally started to even out. His mind, however, was already moving ahead. There was a reason for all of this. There was always a reason. And he was about to find out exactly what it was. Mason's badge hit the pavement first, a small metallic clink against the concrete, barely audible over the hushed murmurs of the crowd. Turner's followed a second later, two symbols of authority, stripped away in an instant. Two men who, moments ago, believed themselves to be untouchable, now stood empty-handed, exposed, and discarded like yesterday's news. "You're suspended. Effective immediately." The words were cold, final, delivered with the weight of something that had already been decided long before the night had begun. Turner, once the cocky leader of this doomed performance, stood rigid, his breath shallow, his mind racing for an escape route that didn't exist. Daniels, the younger cop, stood beside him, but he wasn't frozen with defiance. He was shaking, hands twitching, jaw clenched, as if the weight of what had just happened was finally crushing him from the inside. Shaq watched it unfold without a word. He had seen men unravel before, had seen what happened when power was yanked away from those who abused it. Some fought, some begged. Others simply collapsed under the realization that they had never been as powerful as they believed. Turner was fighting it. His lips parted, desperate to form a defense, but no words came. Daniels, on the other hand, looked like he wanted to be anywhere but here. His wide eyes darted between Shaq, Donovan, and the suited men who had emerged from the government SUV, like they had stepped out of the shadows themselves. One of those men, the lead agent, turned toward Shaq, his face unreadable. "Apologies for the inconvenience, sir." "Sir." A ripple of confusion flickered through the crowd. People exchanged glances, whispering beneath their breath. Some of them had known Shaq's name. Some had recognized him. But this changed everything. Who the hell was Big Shaq? Turner's head snapped toward Shaq at the word, his confusion morphing into something dangerously close to fear. Daniels blinked, his brows knitting together like a man piecing together a puzzle he had never even realized he was part of. Shaq ignored them. His focus had shifted, because just then, the mystery man in the suit, the one who had been watching from the sidelines, the one who had made that cryptic phone call, finally stepped forward. The crowd barely noticed him. He wasn't loud, he wasn't flashy, but the air shifted the moment he moved. Shaq felt it. And when their eyes locked, it was as if time momentarily froze. There was history there, unspoken, heavy, stretching between them like an old wound that had never quite healed. Shaq tilted his head slightly, his voice coming out quiet, but waited. "Took you long enough." A ghost of a smirk touched the man's lips. He adjusted the cuff of his expensive suit, his eyes never leaving Shaq's. "Had to make sure you were still sharp." The response landed between them like a challenge, an acknowledgement, and a warning all at once. Shaq exhaled slowly, running his tongue along the inside of his cheek. He should have known. The moment those cops had pulled him over, the moment the situation escalated faster than it should have, he should have known this wasn't random. This had been orchestrated. But by who? And for what purpose? The suited man studied Shaq, his smirk lingering. He had always been like this. Controlled, composed, playing a game 3 steps ahead of everyone else. Shaq had met a lot of men like him. But this one was different. And that meant only one thing. The real game was just beginning. The echoes of the moment still lingered in the air. Unspoken tension crackling like static electricity. The crowd had transformed from passive onlookers to witnesses to history. Phones were still recording, fingers flying across screens, tweets, live streams, and breaking news updates already painting Shaq as either a wronged man or a walking enigma. But Shaq didn't care about any of that. He barely noticed the cheers, the murmurs, the rush of internet fame surging like a tidal wave around him. His focus was razor sharp, locked onto the remnants of the night's real battle. Mason, the once smirking lead cop, was in cuffs now. His uniform still clung to him, but it had lost its meaning. He wasn't a cop anymore, just another man who had played a game too big for him and lost. But even in his downfall, his eyes still burned with defiance. Shaq had seen that look before, the look of a man who wasn't ready to accept defeat. From the sidelines, Daniels stood motionless, his face caught between relief and guilt. His hands trembled slightly, a man who had just brushed against the edge of something far darker than he'd ever imagined. His entire world had been shaken apart in a single night. Shaq turned to him, his voice even but firm. "Get out," he said, "while you still got a soul." Daniels's mouth opened slightly, as if to respond, but nothing came. He knew Shaq was right. If he stayed in this world, if he followed the same road Mason had, he wouldn't come out the other side as the same man. Shaq had been there before, and he wasn't about to watch another kid get chewed up by the same machine. Daniels swallowed hard. He didn't nod, didn't speak, but something in his posture shifted. A decision had been made. Whether he acted on it or not, that was on him. Mason, however, wasn't done. He turned his glare back to Shaq, his voice low and venomous. "This ain't over." Shaq exhaled through his nose, his expression unreadable. Then he leaned in, just enough that Mason could feel the weight of his words pressing against him. "No," Shaq murmured. "It's just getting started." Mason's jaw tensed, but he said nothing. What could he say? He wasn't holding the cards anymore. A hand landed on Shaq's shoulder. He turned slightly, already knowing who it was before he even looked. The mystery man. The one who had watched from the sidelines, pulled the strings, and waited for the moment to reveal himself. In his hand was a file. Thick, heavy, classified. Shaq took it without hesitation, but he didn't open it. Not yet. The man's smirk was still there, but his voice carried something deeper now. "You're back in," he said, "whether you like it or not." Shaq's fingers tightened around the file. He finally glanced inside. The second he saw what was inside, his expression darkened. Because now he understood. This wasn't about Mason. This wasn't about a traffic stop. This was a warning. And it was just the beginning. Power isn't always loud. Corruption doesn't always wear a badge. Sometimes the real game is happening where no one's looking. Tonight, Big Shaq saw the truth. But how many others never get the chance? For every moment caught on camera, how many are erased? For every injustice exposed, how many go unseen? Pay attention. Speak up. Question everything. Because the next time the game flips, it might not be in front of a crowd. And if you're not watching, you might be the one caught in it.